By late December 1944, the front line in the west followed the course of the Ruhr, Our and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, there was a shallow salient, a bulge in the line, facing the Ardennes, a hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler had launched his most deadly thrust into France in 1940. For the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans had mustered the 6th SS and 5th Panzer Armies and the 7th Army. Facing them were elements of the American 1st and 9th Armies, flanked by the 3rd. On the 16th of December, the Germans attacked. In the north, 6th Panzer Army's progress was slow, but a spearhead broke through and charged headlong for the Meuse. 5th Panzer shattered the first inexperienced American divisions it encountered, and by the 18th was fast approaching Bastogne, a vital road and rail junction. Although poor weather had, as the Germans expected, grounded Allied air forces, the offensive was already behind schedule. Wintry conditions and blown bridges were slowing the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. 5th Panzer had quickly surrounded Bastogne, but the Americans in the town refused to surrender, and by now, the Allies were recovering from the shock of the onslaught. By December the 24th, 1st and 9th Armies, backed by the British 30th Corps, had rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the Meuse. The US 3rd Army now turned 90 degrees and attacked the German flank from the south. On December the 26th, Bastogne was relieved, and with the weather clearing, the Allies unleashed their overwhelming air power. Within 3 weeks of the relief of Bastogne, the Germans had been forced back to their start positions. Hitler had refused to sanction a timely withdrawal, and the delay had cost the Wehrmacht most of their losses, in all 100,000 men and 600 precious tanks. For the German armed forces, the Battle of the Bulge had been a catastrophe. For months, the Western Front had been allocated the bulk of German production of tanks and heavy weapons. Vast numbers had now been expended to no avail. Meanwhile, in the east, the Wehrmacht had been starved of resources. This at a time when the Red Army was stronger and more ably led than at any period in its history. At the beginning of September 1944, 5 German army groups in the east had faced 11 fronts of the Red Army, along a line more than 1,200 miles long. By mid-October, a Soviet drive to clear the Baltic states had left most of Army Group North cut off in the Courland Peninsula, where 20 infantry and 2 armored divisions would remain trapped until the end of the war. To the south, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts had pushed into Romania and Hungary, and by late December had captured Belgrade and encircled the Hungarian capital, Budapest. There, another 188,000 Axis troops were cut off. By the close of 1944, the Red Army had expelled the Germans from Soviet territory and had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. One by one, Germany's Axis allies had fallen by the wayside, and although fighting still raged around Budapest, all along the central and northern sectors of the front, Soviet forces had already begun a careful redeployment for the next major offensive. Planned for January 1945, this would be the final, all-out assault that would take the Red Army into the very heart of Hitler's Reich. To Joseph Stalin, Berlin was the prize desired above all others. As the last refuge of Hitler, the capture of the Reich's capital would be the greatest possible symbol of victory. Stalin profoundly distrusted the Western Allies and was certain they would make a dash for Berlin at the first opportunity, in spite of their assurances. To mislead the Americans, he even claimed that Berlin had lost its significance and that the main target of the last Soviet offensive would be the city of Dresden. In fact, Stalin considered the capture of Berlin so important, he bypassed not just the Stavka, his political military council, but also the Army General Staff. Eventually, in the final stages, he himself would take command of military operations. Unlike Hitler, Stalin was usually prepared to accept the advice of his generals. He had a highly flexible and retentive mind, well suited to military affairs, and often took over briefings from commanders not showing sufficient mastery of their material. At Allied summits throughout the war, the Soviet dictator deeply impressed British and American leaders with his thorough understanding of logistics. Even with his most senior commanders, Stalin was supremely devious and manipulative. While he ordered his generals to cooperate with each other, he also contrived to spur them on by encouraging deep and bitter rivalries. At Stalin's instigation, the final drive on Berlin would be turned into a race in which commander would be pitted against commander. That the result would be a reckless expenditure of Russian lives was, to Stalin, a matter of supreme indifference. On July the 20th, 1944, a bomb had been planted in the conference room of Adolf Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The blast had killed 4 men, but by an amazing turn of luck, Hitler had escaped with minor injuries to his legs and arms. Within hours, the first of thousands of arrests had been made. Even before the attempt on his life, Hitler's relationship with his generals had been stormy, but now he became utterly paranoid. Dependent on cocktails of drugs prescribed by his personal physician, Hitler grew increasingly disturbed, unstable, and prone to violent fits of temper. The gulf between the Führer and his generals was now so great that all meaningful communication had virtually ceased. Hitler took personal control of even the minutest aspect of military operations, and his constant refrain was no withdrawal. The General Staff, desperate to gain room for operational maneuver, still the great strength of the German army, was viewed by Hitler as a collection of weak-willed and cowardly incompetents who refused to stand and fight. Hitler's response to any show of initiative in the field was to sack the offender unceremoniously. In the last 6 months of 1944, the entire army leadership on the Eastern Front had been replaced for one failing or another. The result was a complete collapse of confidence amongst senior German commanders. Many resigned, exasperated beyond endurance. The rest could do little more than stand humiliated on the sidelines, while the German armed forces and Germany itself was led to the brink of catastrophe. In November 1944, the Soviet General Staff had outlined its plan for the greatest campaign in military history. The offensive would span the entire length of the Eastern Front, and fighting would take place in 8 different countries. In spite of the gigantic scale of the planned offensive, the Red Army estimated it would take just 45 days to achieve its objective, the capture of Berlin, the city that Stalin had called the lair of the fascist beast. Unusually, Stalin did not invite his front commanders to a conference where operations and tactics would be discussed. Instead, each was summoned in turn and given his operational area and his objectives. There were to be no arguments and no compromises. Of the 9 Soviet fronts which would take part in the Great Offensive, the 2 mightiest, first Belarusian and first Ukrainian, were chosen to spearhead the drive to Berlin. Standing opposite, blocking the path to the German capital, were Army Groups A and Center. To prevent them being reinforced, supporting attacks would be launched on both flanks. To the north, 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts would drive towards the East Prussian cities of Königsberg and Marienburg. In the south, 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts would clear Hungary and strike into Austria. In the main thrust, 1st Belarusian would drive along a narrow front towards the Polish city of Poznan. At the same time, 1st Ukrainian would strike towards Breslau. Secondary waves of tank armies would then pour through the gaps in German lines and widen the breaches. When the Germans had been pushed to the line of the River Oder, Berlin would be at the mercy of the Red Army. 2 great flanking movements, and Hitler's capital would be doomed. The Soviet offensive was timetabled for the 20th of January 1945. This would give enough time for winter to freeze the notoriously wet Polish roads, and by then, fog would be less of a problem for the Air Force. Meanwhile, the great build-up would commence. Red Army reserves were increased all along the front, and supplies and equipment stockpiled for the operations to come. In preparation, a great propaganda offensive was begun. The Red Army was to be primed for its sweep into Germany by instilling in its ranks the deepest hatred of the German Wehrmacht and people. The keynote was revenge. The sufferings of the Soviet Union at the hands of the Germans were to be repaid in full. With the Red Army only 300 miles from Berlin, a distance the Russians were capable of advancing in as little as 5 weeks, it was obvious to the German High Command that the plight of the capital was desperate. German intelligence calculated that the Soviet attack would begin around January the 12th, and that the enemy enjoyed an advantage of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in guns. Hitler dismissed these estimates as rubbish. No reinforcements would be sent east from the Western Front, nor would German forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula be evacuated by sea to shore up the defences in the central sector. In Hitler's words, the Eastern Front must take care of itself. The result was an absolute dependence on fixed defensive lines, and for months, tens of thousands of civilians had been toiling to transform the Reich into one vast fortress. The Reich's system of defences was based on 7 lines, the longest running for almost 400 miles. Each line bristled with anti-tank ditches, gun positions and village forts, and the defensive zone was almost 300 miles in depth. Scattered throughout were heavily fortified towns or festons. Of these, the most formidable were Königsberg, Insterburg, Poznan, Stettin, Kustrin and Breslau. The second layer of the German defense was behind the River Oder in 3 belts 12 to 25 miles deep. If the Soviet enemy should cross the river and break through to threaten the German capital, they were to be stopped and crushed at the gates of Berlin itself. On its perimeter, the city was guarded by its own fortified defense line. Inside were yet more lines, dividing the capital into independent self-defending sectors, many crisscrossed by waterways. Berlin's massive concrete flak towers were also formidable. Their guns could be trained to fire down into the streets. The will to fight was, the Nazi leadership believed, the key to survival for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. The population, military and civilian, must be made to believe that in defeat they would be given no quarter. For most, there was little difficulty imagining the fate that would befall them at the hands of vengeful Russians. But the West, too, had added fuel to the fire of German resolve. Almost ceaseless bombing of the Reich cities had already left many in ruins, and in the summer of 1944, an Allied plan had been discussed which seemed to promise no mercy for the German people. Germany was to be divided permanently. Huge swathes of territory were to be given to the Soviet Union, Poland, France, and Denmark. All her surviving heavy industry was to be dismantled, and Germany was to be returned to a medieval state of small farmers and a subsistence economy. The plan was supported by Roosevelt, but strongly opposed by Churchill, and was soon dropped. However, for Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, it was priceless material. To the citizens of the Reich, and especially to the inhabitants of its capital, who had suffered so much from Allied bombing, it was yet more proof that the only hope was determined resistance to the very end. By 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had already proved himself the greatest and most aggressive commander in the Red Army. Zhukov was Stalin's favorite general and a popular military hero. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had never once been defeated in battle. Zhukov had successfully defended Leningrad, and at the Battle of Stalingrad had encircled and captured the entire German Sixth Army. Zhukov had also played an important part in the great Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk. Since August 1942, Zhukov had been Deputy Supreme Commander of all Soviet forces, second only to Stalin. He had directed the huge Russian drive across the Ukraine, and as commander of the First Ukrainian Front, had advanced at an astonishing 30 miles a day in early 1944. In June, he took overall command of the Red Army fronts and orchestrated Russia's greatest military achievement of the war so far, the Discretion offensive and the rout of the German Army Group Center. Zhukov's very success now threatened to make him an object of suspicion to Stalin, a situation usually attended with fatal consequences. However, as the finest commander in the history of the Red Army, even the Soviet dictator could not afford to move against him, and in November 1944, Stalin let it be understood that Zhukov's forces should be the ones to attack and capture the Nazi capital. Only on the eve of the attack would Zhukov learn that with Stalin, nothing was certain. Although Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner was an able soldier, he was also one of the most fervent Nazis ever to command a German army. Schörner would follow Hitler's most unrealistic orders to the letter, often with disastrous results. Schörner had been made chief of the National Socialist Leadership Corps in early 1944, and in June was in command of Army Group North during the Soviet summer offensive. With his army, Schörner was trapped on the Courland Peninsula, helpless for 6 months, until in January 1945, he was evacuated to command Army Group Center. During the final Russian attack, far from reflecting the truth of the desperate predicament in which his forces found themselves, Schörner constantly fed Hitler's delusions with promises of victory. On the eve of the last battle, Schörner would be rewarded for his slavishness. Hitler would make him a field marshal and the last commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. During 1944, the Red Army had launched no fewer than 10 major offensives, and as the year had gone on, its performance in the field had improved beyond all recognition. The Russian ability to conduct massive battles of encirclement at speed now equaled or even surpassed the expertise of the German army at the height of its powers early in the war. The Red Air Force had also evolved into supremely proficient service, excelling particularly in tactical operations. Its effectiveness had been radically improved by decentralizing its command structure, so that Soviet air power could respond quickly and flexibly to requests for support from the ground forces. By now, all arms of the Soviet military machine were lavishly equipped with advanced weapons. Russian imperial production freed the Soviet civilian and vast reserve and strategic materials easily replaced the Red Army losses. At the start of 1945, the strength of Soviet forces in the field was over 6 million men, 15,000 combat aircraft, 100,000 artillery pieces, and 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns.